The critical question now is the short-term question. How does the industry survive between now and 2030? How does it get over the hurdle of the coming years?
I also believe it's a precursor to, most people feel, Big Brother monitoring, because the next argument will be, well, in order to accurately monitor this, we need to put a little box in your car and you need to be telling us exactly how many miles you're doing, which is then a precursor to being, well, now we know exactly where you are, how fast you're going, when you're speeding, when you're not. And it feels like it's just an excuse of a precursor to more control in the future.
But the government just saying, well, we've chosen the technology, this is the technology, everybody has to use it, irrespective of what the customer wants. That's never going to work. And I think if you applied that approach in other industries, it would feel a bit ludicrous. Probably people in this country should be eating more fruit and vegetables, but we don't say to Sainsbury's 50% of your sales has to be apples.
It creates a monopoly, because if there's only a couple of players in the market and they're private, you're now into a monopoly situation where they can influence the price to their benefit, not the consumer benefit. And I believe that is a discussion point that says, why don't we protect the users a little bit more and cap how much margin the private companies are allowed to boot onto people? I really passionately feel that the little person, the everyday person that earns the least wages, is getting stiffed the most.
And what we would say is picking an arbitrary date to completely end the sale of non-ZEVs doesn't really feel right. To quote our colleagues over at Toyota, their view is carbon is the enemy, not the powertrain. So we need to be doing everything we can to make sure the consumer has access to the lower or sustainable powertrain that works for them.
Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Future Engineering Bets, where we talk about advanced engineering and its applications in the future in automotive and mobility, electrification, and in particular where people are going to be investing their capital and wondering about what's going to happen in the future. Today I'm very excited to be joined by Patrick Keating of Honda Europe, and he's the head of external affairs at Honda Europe. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here.
Thank you. And we're very excited to talk with you. We're at a very interesting point in electrification journey, in that the UK government is about to review the ZEV mandate that's really seen as crushing the automotive OEMs at the moment in Europe and the UK. Can you tell me a bit about what you're thinking as we come up to this space? Yeah,
it's a really timely question. So we expect government to announce a consultation on reviewing the mandate in the coming days. And that's something that manufacturers have been asking for probably over a year now. We're seeing really a disconnect between the growth of EV sales in the market, in the real world, and the trajectory that's set in this UK regulation. EV sales are growing, and that's brilliant, that's great. This is not an anti-EV pitch. It's about making sure that the rules and the targets that we have to meet on the supply side match what people actually want out there in the market. And I think the new government is realizing there is a gap, and closing that gap is putting a lot of costs onto manufacturers, not just UK manufacturers, but anybody active in the UK market. That's pressing down on competitiveness. It's not a good deal for the automotive industry. So a pragmatic approach, looking at those targets, looking at what we have to achieve between now and 2030, what does 2035 look like when there's this supposed ban on internal combustion engines, just stepping back, taking a beat and having to think, does this work? But not just does the regulation on the supply side work, but what about all the other levers in terms of demand, so incentives, charging, infrastructure, just consumer appetite, are all those on track as well? So really hoping to have a good and sort of open discussion with government in the coming weeks about how we make sure this set of legislation actually works and meets the real world.
It's very challenging times for automotive OEMs, and has been recently. And I'll just, for the sake of the listener, I'm going to quote a few sort of mandate items so they get an appreciation. So in 2035, the UK mandated that all vehicles have to be ZEV, which is zero emission vehicles. Interestingly, we'll come on to Europe shifted, and we'll talk about that. But really 2026, you're expected to hit 33% sales when you're actually around about 25%. Noting that 25% is pretty good. And let's not be faced. But then you're also faced with fines for vehicles that don't meet the mandates of around £12,000 a vehicle, maybe £15,000 a van, which are very punitive measures for automotive. So when you're looking at this cycle of between now and 2035 and asking for a rethink, some people say, well, just lighten it up until 2030, but stick with the 2035 zero emission mandate. We're going to talk around a few topics such as hybrids, fuel cell, e-fuels in this episode. What's your thoughts when people say it's okay, just deal with the next 2 or 3 years as a short-termism, but keep the long-term goal?
I think you have to look at both questions. So the critical question now is the short-term question. How does the industry survive between now and 2030? How does it get over the hurdle of the coming years? So that's the critical question. But you're right to look at the longer term. Automotive is an industry that works on long time scales. 2035 is basically tomorrow. And what we would say is picking an arbitrary date to completely end the sale of non-ZEVs doesn't really feel right. I think what we would say is do the review now, look at the short term, but continue to review the regulation as we move towards 2030, as we move beyond 2030 to 2035. On a broader sense, Honda has always said we prefer what we call a multi-pathway approach. So to quote our colleagues over at Toyota, their view is carbon is the enemy, not the powertrain. So we need to be doing everything we can to make sure the consumer has access to the lower or sustainable powertrain that works for them, whether that's for some will be a hybrid, for others a plug-in, for some an electric vehicle. And sort of pulling a lever and saying 2035, the only thing that you can buy is an EV doesn't feel like it's very consumer oriented. It feels like 2035 is a bit of an abstract target. We need to keep on reviewing as we move towards that point.
Yeah, and it's not just that it doesn't work for all the consumers, it's that there's a number of consumers in more edge cases that simply won't have a solution in 2035 that just hasn't been considered because the mandate's really been made around people living in towns with the need of small cars.
Yeah, I think if at the current moment you're lucky enough to live in a home with off-street parking, your own driveway or another solution, you have a deal with an energy company that gives you cheap day-night charging or agile charging, then an EV's perfect. But if you're like me, live in the countryside, my commute is 100 miles each way, so I'm doing a 200-mile round trip. I have the ability to charge at home, but I'm driving a plug-in hybrid now, so I have the ability to charge at home, get cheap miles, free electric miles for my jobs around where I live, and then when I come into Bracknell, I can rely on the petrol engine to get me there and back without worrying about plugging in and charging. And I think there's always going to be those edge cases. I think sometimes, as you said, we're thinking about this policy in the context of people living in cities, but I grew up in Scotland, which can have some pretty wild and remote places where maybe there isn't going to be, easy access to charging. But also, as Honda, we're thinking more globally. So in Europe, I think, we're quite lucky to be fairly affluent to have the ability to put in place charging. But I think there's parts of the world where charging infrastructure is just never going to come down the road. And we need to be thinking about those technologies that support people's mobility. Because at the end of the day, it's about ensuring that people can be mobile, they can get around and live their lives, do their jobs in an affordable and accessible way.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point. We'll go into Europe, that this is a global challenge. And to think about it in a very isolated way, which currently the UK looks like it's quite isolated, doesn't seem very pragmatic. And it's very relevant to say that a huge proportion of the world will never end up with a significant EV charging infrastructure and will likely end up on some form of synthetic e-fuel or hybrid powertrain, likely being not a plug-in hybrid powertrain, in order to support their long-term needs. So going a totally different direction to the whole global community, when you take it as a single piece, doesn't necessarily make sense for the UK people, UK population long term, because that likely means the UK cost of living is going to be pushed up as they end up in a different place to everybody else.
Yeah, I think you're right to look at the global picture. And I think the global picture has changed so much in the last few years, particularly looking at North America. So for a lot of OEMs, North America is a large market. A lot of companies are thinking, how do we supply EV into the North American market? Obviously, under the new administration, or it's not that new anymore, there's been significant rule change, which means a lot of investment's been postponed or reallocated, which means there are fewer EVs in the supply, which means potentially it's harder to supply EV into the UK market from global sources. And I think that applies across the board, which again, when we're looking at the ZEV mandate review, there's a very different global picture around the economics of EV supply chains than there was a few years ago when this regulation was being put into force. So I think, again, that's why government needs to to take account of it. As you say, there'll be different powertrains that work for different parts of the world. So if you're in, I don't know, in sub-Saharan Africa or Kazakhstan, you're going to have a very different approach to this than somebody who happens to live in, you know, London or Amsterdam or Paris and has access to all this great infrastructure charging. So that's why, again, we can't rule out any technology or any powertrain. I think we need to keep on looking at all the opportunities and not just myopically focus on pure battery electric, which is, again, a great technology. It has a definitely, you know, the future is electric for most people, but not necessarily for everyone.
And it's interesting when you talk about that. When you look at Europe, they've shifted their policies from 100% mandate in 2035 to a 90%, which allows this flexibility in powertrain options. Honda's had to go through one of the largest write-downs in its history, one of the first years, I think, in its history that it made a loss overall as a global organization. When people set in place these regulations and the automotive companies lined up with them and set their product development cycles to line up with them, the lack of alignment with the consumer demand was not necessarily considered by all the automotive OEMs, in so much as they assume that everyone would be buying in accordance with government targets. They've not. That's left the automotive OEMs carrying the loss. And that write-down's been absolutely massive. I know partly because in North America, you've had to write off plans of selling cars. In Europe, sales have been behind. Where does it sit for you in terms of seeing the European mandate shift? Has it got to a place that you think this is practical? And if we want to align with it, would you make further improvements to the European mandate as well?
Yeah, I think we would look. So in Europe, it's still a live discussion. So we've seen a proposal from the Commission to give us that 90% target in 2035. But that 10% reduction is actually, in the initial proposal, surrounded by all sorts of conditionality. So you can get that reduction if you use green steel, whatever that is. There's a lot of connection between getting flexibilities under the European regulation with this idea of EVs being made in Europe, so a little bit of a protectionist approach. So on looking at the tin, it seemed like 90%, bit of flexibility, bit of pragmatism. But when you open up and start to look at the detail, it's not quite as rosy a story. So one of the things that we, and by we I mean the entire industry in Brussels, have been working on is, as that proposal goes through the regulatory process and the rulemaking process, trying to push a little bit more to say, can we remove some of those conditions or make them a little bit more reasonable, so that 90% reduction is really a reduction to 90% rather than something that's just a bit cosmetic. And I think rulemakers in Brussels understand that. If you look at the news, you see job losses in Germany. The industry across Europe is under significant pressure. And I think the policymakers, particularly in the European Parliament, are starting to understand that. Through the course of the rest of 2026, hopefully we'll see those rules in Europe become much more pragmatic, much more open, and open to a range of technologies and a range of powertrains, not just being purely focused on EV. And it would be great if the UK could look to try and align with that. Europe is still one region, despite Brexit, is still, you know, almost a common market for automotive. So the more that those rules are aligned, the better the industry can function and be competitive.
So when you talk about the 90% mandate in Europe that's been discussed, as you rightly point out, when we talk about tailpipe emissions versus the overall cycle of the manufacturer, some of what I perceive in the EV journey so far has been almost hypocritical, that somebody can end up driving around a 3 to 4 ton SUV under the quotation marks clean electric vehicle, tax-free or tax reduced on the UK government or other governments, when, I don't know, a 1,1600 kilogram ICE overall seems a far more efficient use of materials, cradle to grave, as well as the overall footprint over time. Now, I know there's strong arguments to say EV cleans itself up after, 10, 15,000 miles or whatever the exact number is. But it seems hypocritical that everybody's used it as an excuse to make things very heavy. The average car is 500 kilograms, often heavier than its ICE counterpart. Streets are being trashed. Bushes leave holes in the ground where the EV buses pull up, and they leave holes in the bus stops. You know, it's not been thought through necessarily at this point that it needs considering not just the tailpipe, but the total life cycle of the product.
Yeah, and I think that's true across the piece. And I think definitely one of the things that we challenge policymakers to think about in all policy areas, not just this, but everything they're working on, is what is the broader context, what is the broader impact? What are the unforeseen consequences, the second order consequences? And sometimes, and this is a personal bugbear, politicians like to pull the quick lever that says easy win, quick solution. Great, move everybody to EVs, jobs are good. But what about demand on the grid? As you say, what about the weight impact of EVs on the infrastructure and on the roads? What about disposing of batteries? What about the production of EVs? I sometimes think some of those questions aren't necessarily addressed as deeply as they could be. Or if you try to raise those questions, then you're going, oh, you're an anti-EV person. No, not at all, not in the least. But we need to think holistically. And I think the culture of companies like Honda, where we think quite deeply, we have this approach we call the 5 whys. So when you're addressing a problem, ask why 5 times. And eventually you should get to the root cause. Don't just ask why once, because you won't get the right answer. And I think sometimes policymakers go, great, we'll pull this lever, we'll ask why once, here's a solution, and we don't get it. Diesel is a great example. So I think in this country and in Europe as well, there was a big push by policymakers a few years ago. Everybody drive diesel, fuel duty on diesel was reduced, the messaging was moved to diesel, and then a few years later, oh, wait, that didn't quite work out. Everybody pulled away from diesel, moved in a different way. That confuses customers, and it just creates this vacuum of uncertainty. So I think my call to policymakers always is think a little bit more deeply, reflect a little bit more deeply, ask experts, and ask those 5 whys to get to the situation. Or if you are going to take a measure saying we want more EVs on the roads, well, okay, what do I have to do to make sure that I'm putting in place countermeasures to any potential negative impact? Yes, you're really going to reduce emissions. You'll help people reduce their fuel costs if they're driving EV. But have I thought about, do I need to give councils more budget for road repairs? Do I need to think about how insurance companies treat multi-story car parks that are going to be full of EVs? So it's a lot of questions that need to be worked through, and I'm not necessarily sure that they are at the moment.
No, I don't think they have been. I think we could all, I can certainly say that, even if you can't in terms of your position, but I don't think they have been. My other comment would be that quite often they rely on very academic leaning studies that I would say, as somebody who has worked in academic spin-outs and high-tech companies involving academia, that the practicalities aren't always considered, but they're very influential. Universities are very influential in policy making, and often industry maybe doesn't get enough of a say, and the reality of the consumer doesn't get enough of a say in said policy making.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think it's true in both Brussels and London, and I'm sure in other capitals as well. So a politician loves to get a nice, well-researched study with, an academic logo on it, or something that's come from a think tank or an NGO, and it's got nice charts and numbers, and that's great. But does it reflect the real-world experience of people? I think the good example is at the Europe level, we're seeing a lot of studies from a lot of the NGOs saying charging is the problem. There's X number of chargers across Europe, and they just push that raw number out. But when you look at people's real experience, well, maybe across the entire EU, there's a huge number of chargers and it's growing. But if I'm in an industrial estate in Charleroi trying to return a rental car and can't find one, that's a lived experience that's playing into my perception of EVs and how easy they are to use. So I think, again, it's getting policymakers to be out in the real world, and not to sound all Daily Mail about it, but a bit of common sense and practicality. Centre of Westminster, every second lamppost is a charger. Brilliant. Yeah. But you come down to where I live in around Weston-super-Mare, it's a very different situation. So be in the real world is what I always say.
There's life outside of London.
There's life outside of London, surprisingly.
It sometimes doesn't feel so. So it takes me naturally on to talking about governments really dictating technology rather than setting policies that really allow the technology people to define the technology, let the policymakers dictate targets that are in line with what people need, but also are realistic. And I think one of the things this whole ZEV mandate really brings up is governments assuming that they understand technology enough to dictate the direction that everyone needs to go in, when, like you talk about Honda wanting a multi-powertrain approach, which anybody that understands heavy-duty goods like commercial vehicles, marine, aviation, rail, when you look at the complete picture, having a ZEV mandate that says everything's banned you've got diggers on sites,
Yeah.
you've got, it just goes on and on and on with the construction industry. There's so many industries that haven't been considered as to how they would run in 2035 onwards. What's your position on governments meddling in technology rather than what they actually understand?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of it. I think governments should never pick winners and they should never pick technologies. I think they should set a target or direction. So they should say by 2050 we want to hit net zero. Great, that's a clear target. We understand the direction. As Honda is a company that's got what we call action to 000. So essentially, we will look to do no harm, reduce fatalities on the roads and accidents on the roads, and reduce the amount of materials we're using. So really, sustainability is at the core of what we do. So that direction is clear. But we're the ones making the products. We're the ones interacting with the customers. We're the ones operating in the real world. Let us and our competitors choose the right technologies that will work. Sometimes that will fail, but let us fail. Because one of the things that our previous European president said is, failure isn't bad. You fail, you learn, you move on. But a government just saying, well, we've chosen the technology, this is the technology, everybody has to use it, irrespective of what the customer wants. That's never going to work, because customer choice is so important. If I tell you, you have to buy this is the only option you have, a lot of customers will say, well, no. And then you risk people clinging on to their older cars. The best way you can achieve a carbon reduction today is if somebody takes their 10-year-old car and trades it in for anything new. Immediate reduction in carbon, be it BEV or hybrid. So I think just let those customers make the right choice that works for them, that gives them the technology that meets their daily needs and fits their lives. That's going to be a much more effective way to move towards reducing emissions from transport than simply saying, we have decided this is the technology that you want. And I think if you applied that approach in other industries, it would feel a bit ludicrous. Probably people in this country should be eating more fruit and vegetables, but we don't say to Sainsbury's 50% of your sales has to be apples.
It's really great point that is, Patrick. And also, when you look at, I'm not sure, I was trying to think earlier of a single other industry that has such onerous demands on its products and the reduction in CO2, in emissions. I can't think of another industry that has any such demands on them that's they're expecting the OEMs to absorb. And I think you made a really great point earlier in terms of there are huge amounts of redundancies happening across Europe already because of the drop in demand and the upkick in the Chinese market and the issues seen in writing down the technologies and the EV platforms that have been slowed down in production. To say that the automotive industry is being punished would appear to be a fairly fair statement based on fact.
Yeah, punished is maybe a strong word, but I think it's definitely a challenging time when, look at my role and we're looking at all the regulation and policy that's coming towards the automotive industry. It's a huge list. If you look at all the requirements that a car company has to meet in terms of the safety of the product, emissions, a lot more about data and connectivity, that's all being regulated, the due diligence, the sustainability requirements. It's a huge list of regulatory burdens that adds up and up and up and up. So I think the industry is definitely under challenge. I think there's some in the political world that realize that and are looking to support us, but I think not everybody gets it. And I think there are some who I don't necessarily agree with who say, well, if we keep on pushing you towards electrification, that will help you win this global race against other regions. I'm not convinced that's the right direction. Again, I say, let the companies take the approach that they think will work and will resonate with their customers, because we're the ones that know our customers and know our market and know the technology the best.
Absolutely. I can't agree with you more, Patrick. So that takes me on to the infrastructure question and what I class as the poverty premium in public infrastructure and public EV charging specifically. So when you look at some of the statistics, so there's 5% VAT on home electric. So people with driveways can charge their vehicle on a drive. They get cheap electric, maybe an overnight tariff, but certainly 7-8 pence a kilowatt. Then they pay 5% VAT on that. So they're making significant savings. But people with driveways don't represent the vast majority of society. Now, everybody else is paying not only 20% VAT on the electric, but the public charging infrastructure, there is zero regulation on pricing, which means people are paying 60, 70, 80, 90 pence a kilowatt, which is often more expensive than its petrol counterpart. And there's no control. So whilst the government mandate really controls what the automotives are meant to be saying to people. There is zero control on the cost of fuel for what I class as people that are everyday people, most commonly live in flats, terraced houses, you know, those streets where you drive down and cars are parked on every single bit of pavement, bit of grass, all over the place, maybe in multi-stories. It's simply not as realistic as the dream of driving on your driveway and plugging in. That's not most people's reality.
It's not. And I think I recognize that. I'm lucky enough to have a house with a driveway, but the village I live in, it's arranged. So there's some people that have a house with a driveway. There's some people that live in lovely ancient cottages that have no driveway, that have curbside parking. And then we've got, as you say, the streets with a turning circle where everybody's parked on the grass and on the verges. So it's a really, I think, the word I would almost use is about equity. Is there charging equity? And I would say there isn't. So again, the raw number of public chargers across the country and across Europe may be right, but are they properly distributed? I think on the pricing piece, I'm never one to call for price controls or price caps. I'm a bit more libertarian than that. But I think there is a real role for price transparency. So when you're driving down the motorway or you're driving around town, you'll see at any petrol station, you'll see the price of diesel, you'll see the price of petrol. You can go on loads of apps and see, okay, I could go to the Shell station. That's going to give you a discount over BP as an example. But you don't really have that for EV charging. So if you're driving down the motorway, do you go, oh, I'll stop at memory services, or I'll hang on and pull off the motorway and go to this other one? That transparency isn't there. So I think there's definitely a role for the regulator in ensuring that there is price transparency, because as you say, sometimes you can charge up at a rapid charger and go, that was more expensive than a tank of petrol. That's not how this is meant to work. I think the other point you made on equalizing VAT between home and public charging is spot on. It's almost quite regressive, isn't it, that people have a nice house with a driveway are getting to charge their EV cheaper than the person on the terrace or on the turning circle. That's a conversation that the industry's been having with government for quite some time. Some parts of government have been sympathetic to the argument, but in the end, those that hold the pen over the budget haven't moved yet. But I'm hoping that in time, and maybe as part of this cost push to reduce cost of living, that's something that could be looked at. But again, if you're trying to get whole society moving towards a car with a plug in it, and you're not giving people that opportunity to charge at a reasonable price, it doesn't really play towards that. And I think the last thing I would say, again, about the distribution of charging is the car industry has a mandate on what we have to sell. The EV charging industry doesn't have a mandate on where they have to put their chargers. So they have an incentive to say, right, we'll put our chargers in the nice leafy suburbs of the center of cities. I think they need to be pushed to be putting chargers into areas where there's not demand yet, in order to give people reassurance. If I do go for an EV, there is a charger on my block. There is a charger in the Tesco's car park. But the EV industry needs to be pushed to put those in there ahead of demand. Maybe it'll be less profitable in the short term, but it helps to give that consumer confidence.
There's some fantastic points there, Patrick. I'm going to pick up on one that I'm going to take a slightly different stance on,
Sure.
and that is the pricing point. So I get the libertarian sort of point of view on pricing. One of the things I see happening is that the public infrastructure is being put in by private companies. They want a return on their investment, clearly, to put the infrastructure in place. So to your point, they're choosing where to put those based on the highest demand, not on giving coverage to the population. So if you're in a city, maybe on a city suburb, you're going to get the highest amount of people using it. So you shove your infrastructure there. You may well be meeting increases in numbers of charges, but you're not creating extra coverage. It's like the classic phone network piece. However, when you start to look at the lack of pricing control, when you look at there's 2 or 3 companies particularly very active, I'm not going to name them, but one of them is begins with a capital O and is very active in the electricity industry. While they're trying to have an app that consolidates all the charges in the infrastructure, you've not only got more and more mouths to feed from the electricity company providing the electric to the infrastructure owner to the app owner. So there's several mouths now taking out of it. But it creates a monopoly, because if there's only a couple of players in the market and they're private, you're now into a monopoly situation where they can influence the price to their benefit, not the consumer benefit. When I talked just before the meeting, I remember in the holiday sector, in the holiday parks, when people are sold electricity from the holiday park. Let's take a Park Dean, Haven Holidays. They sell people a larger caravan, and there's a cap on how much they can upsell the electric through to the end user for the protection of the end user. And I wonder, and I believe that is a discussion point that says, why don't we protect the users a little bit more and cap how much margin the private companies are allowed to boot onto people? And also, should the government not be thinking about a public app that actually allows you to go up to any public charger and pay something that's not controlled by a private company?
Yeah.
And I think there's an argument there that says we've not really thought through that part of it, because I really passionately feel that the little person, the everyday person that earns the least wages, is getting stiffed the most. And a lot of the 25% EV sales that we get now, it's fleet and it's company cars. And there's going to reach a point when we push from the company cars into the private sector. I haven't got the numbers in front of me. How much of the private sales are currently EV versus how much of company cars are EV? It's going to be harder and harder. The resistance gets higher pushing into private, because we've simply not solved these problems, because those people are worried, how do I pay 80, 90 pence a kilowatt, whilst Bob down the road's managing to put it through his drive and through his company and get all the tax benefits involved.
Yeah, I think you identify the problem very, very correctly. And I think, again, as you say, as that adoption curve increases, you are going to meet more resistance as you enter it. And well, we know 25%, that's still the 75% of sales to go, isn't there? So I think addressing that equity issue is vital. Whether it's price caps, I don't know. And I think government needs to think about what levers it can pull. So when you look at petrol, they play with fuel duty, don't they, as a cost of living thing. Could they be doing the same with VAT on public charging? That's probably the easiest win, isn't it, is to equalize
They can reduce that.
VAT and then in such a way that the operators don't just absorb that
Absolutely.
and pass on the VAT cut to the customer. It's a problem that has to be addressed. I'm not enough of an energy economist to know the right solution, but there must be a way to do it. And I think the cost of the EVs itself are coming down. So I think we are reaching a point where there's, on some models, price parity between a petrol car and its EV equivalent. So I think that issue is becoming more and more, or less of an issue. But I think you're right. It's that lack of equity in charging that's really going to hit people. And I think as well, when you look towards the future, and we see in this country, at least, government's considering introducing a pay per mile charge for EVs to replace the lost fuel duty. Again, that feels a little bit regressive, because some of the people who drive the most are the people that really rely on their cars. People getting to shifts at night shifts at 4 a.m. when there's no bus, or people living in rural areas. That again feels a little bit regressive and plays against an equitable transition to sustainable mobility.
I absolutely agree. And you know what? We didn't cover that so far, but that single piece has caused quite a large amount of confusion, because it doesn't just hit the EVs. They've gone after plug-in hybrids.
They have as well. Yeah.
For those that are using the cycle, they're already paying the tax on the plug-in hybrid because it's got a petrol engine. Yeah. And now they're going to pay an additional tax because when they're using it on EV mode, the government wants more money out of them for the tax on it. So I find it a very bizarre policy that's causing confusion, because people are now confused. And I also believe it's a precursor to, most people feel, Big Brother monitoring, because the next argument will be, well, in order to accurately monitor this, we need to put a little box in your car and you need to be telling us exactly how many miles you're doing, which is then a precursor to being, well, now we know exactly where you are, how fast you're going, when you're speeding, when you're not. And it feels like it's just an excuse of a precursor to more control in the future. And I think that really gets most people's backs up, because this is meant to be something that's meant to be for the good of sustainability, and it gets used for other ulterior motives. Yeah,
I think in the most recent consultation on the pay per mile charge, they were saying, well, we'll just check it at MOT time and it'll be a paper. But I think you're right. And I know there have been a few firms sort of doing the round saying, well, we have a solution that's a tech-based solution that we can use GPS and so on. And again, that feels a bit, it doesn't pass the smell test, does it?
It's very invasive.
It's very invasive. So I think what we're saying and what the industry said is the pay per mile thing is just the wrong policy at the wrong time. Yeah. Because again, we're still only at 25%. We've got a long way to go to get to 100, and you're sending a signal. And I think people are clever. People respond to signals, and they go, oh, okay, government's introducing a tax on this thing. Tax is a great way to disincentivize people from doing things. It's government departments playing against each other. Sure, in future there will be less fuel duty because people will be driving fewer petrol cars and buying less petrol. Yes, that'll have to be replaced in future. But if at the moment your main priority is getting more people in EVs, then don't be sending these signals at this time. I think there's almost a complacency that the trajectory set, it's all fair winds and plain sailing. But I think it won't be if you keep on sending these incoherent or inconsistent signals to people.
Absolutely. So let's move on to hybrids, fuel cell vehicles, and e-fuels. Taking hybrids first. Honda's obviously very active in the hybrid space, and part of the hope for the 90% type target, or a more pragmatic carbon reduction target, would be that it allows both the plug-in hybrid, the PHEV, and also the HEV, the hybrid vehicles, and there's various configurations and range extenders and all sorts of things that are in the market. How do you get it through to the policymakers that PHEV delivers significant carbon savings, even when people are driving on petrol, because it's still using regenerative braking? You've got the traffic moving. Anyone that's owned a hybrid that operates well knows that rolling around towns on EV mode, getting extra energy from braking, it's a significant saving overall, and it allows for the wide range of duty cycles that is practical for most people.
Yeah. So as you said, Honda's really leaning into full hybrid technology globally for a range of reasons. So one is providing people with reduced emissions at a much more accessible and affordable way. So you remove that entire infrastructure and charging issue by saying, well, put petrol in it, and as you drive it, the computer will work with the battery to deliver the most emissions reduction and electric miles possible. So it's brilliant. So for people who aren't necessarily ready to make the leap to an EV now, because of all the issues we've talked about, if you put them into a full hybrid, you're already delivering immediate emissions reductions, immediate sustainability, and getting them used to the idea of electrified driving. And we see when people go full hybrid, they tend not to go back. And if you look at the numbers, I don't have them to hand, full hybrid is a pretty significant share of new sales growing across the region. So there's a huge benefit there. And we think that technology has a role to play for the medium and the longer term. So in this country, we know in 2030, government intends to end the sale of conventional petrol and diesel and allow something towards 2035. One of the things that will be in the upcoming consultation is the definition of what exactly is the kind of hybrid that we can sell during that period. We would say that that definition should support full hybrid, not just plug in with an arbitrary, if it does 80 kilometers on a charge, then it works. I think there's more nuanced and subtle thinking needs to take place than that sort of arbitrary cutoff point. Plug-in hybrid technology also plays an important role. I'm driving a plug-in now, and as I was saying earlier, it's brilliant. So I can do about 80 kilometers on a charge, which gets me all my local journeys done around where I live, and then switch to hybrid driving. I wouldn't say petrol driving, hybrid driving for the motorway segment. And it delivers, significant fuel savings, electric miles, and is a great technology. But I think as we're working on this policy, there is a lot of pushback from some. And to come back to the academic studies, we see some academic studies saying, oh, well, X percentage of people don't plug in their plug-in. Well, it's still in petrol mode running on the hybrid drivetrain. And I think a lot of people do plug it in. I think if you have the benefit of having cheap at-home charging, you'd be stupid not to plug it in. It's just basic common sense economics. So there is a big role for these technologies that are, I wouldn't say they're transitional technology to fuel electric. I think they play a bigger role than a transition, but they do support people in moving into more sustainable mobility, starting to understand electrified mobility. Maybe as the next step, they move into an EV, or maybe for them, hybrid is the perfect sweet spot.
Some fantastic points in there. I particularly like talking around that hybrid vehicles are in hybrid mode when using petrol.
Yes.
As we've already talked about, and therefore it's not the same as running a petrol car. People do see advantages of charging. So in a plug-in situation, there's also huge amounts of the global community that don't have a plug-in situation, won't have. So therefore a full hybrid vehicle is going to be perfect in the long run for getting efficiencies and gains. When we look at the 2035 target, without having a strategy across Europe and the UK, certainly, and what you'd really want it wider globally, that says we understand that hybrid really is a transition technology, but I'd say a long-term actual application. I personally believe in hybrid as a long-term technology. You're right that somebody who's not had any experience in an electric vehicle can get a hybrid, get a plug-in hybrid or a full hybrid, and move on the journey. And maybe their EV will be the next car after that. But the full jump for a lot of people with the range anxieties, with the infrastructure shortfalls, just buying it for everybody just isn't suitable. I can't understand why policymakers that lean on this academic research, that lean on the studies, don't see what seems blatantly obvious to anyone that understands technology and engineering and automotive, that hybrid is the future, with EV playing a part in that too.
Yeah. And again, I think, I won't paint policymakers all with the same brush, because I think there are some that get it. And, the number of MEPs I talk to go, I drive a hybrid, it's brilliant, it fits all my needs, amazing. So they get it. But I think there are some who, again, they just want to pull that single lever and solve all the problems with EVs or the silver bullet, bosh, done. I think we just need to continue to work to help those people understand that's not a realistic solution for everybody. I think there are some that go, any emissions of any kind are unacceptable. In a previous life, I worked in the tobacco industry, and I stretched the parallel somewhat, but there was a discussion, do we move people from cigarettes, which we all agree are terrible and bad for you, to vapes? And if you move people from cigarettes to vapes, which are 90% safer, you save a lot of lives, you reduce the cost of treasury and the healthcare system. But those people who still want to enjoy nicotine and still or need it for some reason in their lives have an option that's safer. But you had a large community that said, no, vapes are bad. Just stop entirely. It was almost called quit or die. And it's a little bit similar in this transition, going from, well, here's the technology, we all agree, the conventional ICE, it has to transition and move and become more sustainable. Here's a midpoint, a compromise, a fuzzy gray area that works for a lot of people. But you still have some that say, no, we need perfect. So I think it's about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Here's a technology that delivers a lot of benefit, that works for everybody, avoids a lot of the challenges we see around EVs. Let's create an atmosphere where that can work and can thrive, not just rule it out because it happens to
absolutely
operate on a bit of petrol from time to time.
Yeah. And I think to see progress in that space for me, in the hybrid space, because if something's not set in place for 2035 that's more pragmatic, it really restricts the OEMs in terms of, well, how do we develop then? Because like you say, 10 years away is nothing in an OEM. So you need more support for the long-term hybrid technology.
Yeah.
Moving on to e-fuels, synthetic fuels, and hydrogen fuel cells. We'll go through hydrogen fuel cells quite quickly, because it's not going to be an active technology as we've discussed in automotive now. It's been tried many times. There's a lot of demonstrators. There's still a lot of options around motorbikes, potentially rail, HGVs, like commercial vehicles. What's the general thinking around hydrogen fuel cell for you?
Yeah, so we've been looking at fuel cell for quite some time, and hydrogen, I think, is an important part of the mix in Japan. We're seeing a lot of thinking around it. Agree that it's probably not the solution for passenger car. We piloted fuel cell passenger cars here in Europe for a short while, in Japan, in California. The economics of it don't quite work out. What we see is more opportunities around heavy duty applications, so as you said, so for trucks, potentially for heavy marine. Marine is one of the most polluting forms of transport. If you can move from burning bunker fuel to using hydrogen, I think there's a huge emissions savings and sustainability maneuver. But we're also looking at stationary applications. So for instance, when you're looking at data centers, which need to have a constant, reliable source of energy, often their backup will be diesel or petrol generators. If you can replace that with a fuel cell backup solution, a stationary solution, again, there's a massive amount of emissions that's reduced. So that's really where we're seeing potential opportunity from our point of view. I know across the industry, others are looking at, for instance, using hydrogen in ICE engines for heavy duty applications, or potentially non-road mobile machinery
what
applications.
Dirty hydrogen.
Dirty hydrogen,
But it means you can be less pure with the hydrogen,
yeah,
which is far more usable and far cheaper than getting the very high grade purities that's required to run a fuel cell.
Yeah, I think there'll be a range of applications where hydrogen plays a role. I think the interesting question is around e-fuels or liquid fuels or carbon neutral fuel, whatever we're calling them today.
They come from a variety of sources. But, let's to end on the e-fuels then. Closed carbon, let's call it. So for the viewer, if you don't understand, whereas an EV has no tailpipe emissions, an e-fuel would, but the idea is that it puts out no more than it took out of the climate and the environment to begin with. So it's closed loop. You take carbon out of the environment and you put it back in through burning it again.
Yeah.
So there's an argument to say, well, it's making no difference doing it And there's 1.4 billion cars estimated on the roads globally, 300 million in Europe, that are going to be around for a long time. Future cars being able to move on e-fuels and sustainable fuels. Motorsport's very keen on it and pursuing it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so it's definitely an area where we're looking at. So there's quite a lot of conversation going on with the colleagues in R&D. And in fact, last year, our R&D colleagues worked with counterparts at BMW, Toyota, and Bosch, I think, to do what they called the Tour of Europe. So using a vehicle that ran on carbon neutral fuels to drive around Europe and demonstrated the sort of carbon neutral mileage it could get, which was showcasing that you can use these in existing vehicles. So there's definitely an opportunity around that legacy fleet that you mentioned. I think people are holding onto their cars for longer and longer. We'll have those people that go, I don't want to buy an EV or hybrid. So what do we do to help them reduce their emissions? So that's probably where there's a role for those fuels. I think also for applications that are hard to electrify. Motorcycles are a good example. Potentially some construction equipment and so on will be hard to electrify. Definitely a role for low carbon fuels there. But I think there's a role for governments to be supporting R&D into developing those fuels and making sure the rules and regulations around them are correct. So we know in Europe, in the discussion around the European CO2 regulation, there's discussion around how do we define a car that runs only on sustainable fuels, and what's the technology and the systems that we have to put into place into that vehicle to make sure that's what's happening and people aren't just shoving petrol in it. So I think it's a fascinating area, but still in its early days. And I think a lot of work to be done to make sure it works right, that it's economical, that the scale's there of those fuels. So there's a risk a little bit sometimes, I think, that, you know, these carbon neutral fuels, if they're not developed at scale and at mass and an affordable price point, maybe they become for some rich guy's Porsche on a Sunday. Yeah. He can continue to do that, but is it available to the little guys, you were saying? So I think that's an interesting question we need to flesh out.
Yeah, and certainly from in terms of the infrastructure, it's already there. You just need to fill it with the e-fuel and you can carry on. Well, I mean, thank you so much for joining me today, Patrick. It's been wonderful to have you on. Is there anything you want to say about Honda in Europe and what you're hoping for in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, so I think, as we said, there's a lot going on, but I think my message that I continue to push to regulators in London or Brussels is, as you're setting policy, always put the customer first. At Honda, we're a customer-focused company. Let's think about what people need to help them move into sustainable mobility and not just be focused purely on sustainability being around electric cars. What are the role of hybrids? What are the role of motorcycles? What are the role of e-bikes? Let's look at it holistically and not just pull one lever. Let's pull as many levers as we can.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me. You've been watching and listening to Future Engineering Bets. Please do share this episode with other people that are going to find it interesting. Do like and follow. Have a look at what Honda Europe are doing and look at Patrick online. And I'll see you on the next episode.